So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jordan Stanger-Ross today. My name's Rainer Thwaites, and I'm on the law faculty here. The project to which he'll speak today on the history of the banishment of Japanese Canadians is part of a 7-year project, which builds on an earlier 7-year project, I think, on the internment and dispossession of Japanese Canadians focused on confiscation of property. We all want to hear from Jordan, and I'll be quick and get to the substance. But this is my chance to, record my admiration for the ambition and nature of the projects in which Jordan's been involved. As some of you here know, he has been, preceded by leading research collectives, so involving academics, community leaders, museum professionals, students, and teachers. And I sort of, have been, sort of learning and watching as to the way in which, he brings together all these disparate groups to all these different knowledge practices and to try and, bring about sort of different products and different through the collaboration. And I find the ambition of his projects, coupled with the quality and care evident in the work it generates, publications, exhibitions, and more, inspiring. Demonstrating not just achievement, but openness and generosity of vision. Just quickly, it just remains to say thanks to a number of people. This talk is jointly supported by the Law School and also by the Discipline of History at Sydney. It's part of Law's Visiting Speaker Series. And I note that History also has, thanks to James and others, has the History on Wednesday series with obviously additional talks on other days. So from History, thanks to James, Nero, Michael and Chris for advertising it. And may this be the start of beautiful things at the nexus of law and history. And also thanks to Nikkei Australia for advertising the talk and for coming today. Those interested in the history of the Japanese community in Australia, who are not familiar with their work, should look it up and do so. And finally, thanks to Ashley, Joe, and to all in the events team for so competently setting up this talk and others. Like many things that are done well, the smoothness with which things happen makes it very easy to overlook the work involved. Jordan will talk for about 30 to 35 minutes, which should leave us ample time for questions. And I'd now welcome Jordan to step up. Thank you.
Thank you, Rainer, and to everyone who's come today. The work I'm going to speak about today is from a collaboration that I have, an ongoing collaboration with my friend and colleague, Eric Adams, who's in a School of Law at the University of Alberta, and we're jointly writing a book from which this is a chapter. And so it's wonderful to be supported by a Department of History and a School of Law here today to give this talk, because that's precisely where this talk emerges from. In 1945, Canada tried to exile as many Japanese Canadians from the country as possible. Almost 22,000 Japanese Canadians, some 2/3 of them British subjects and Canadian nationals, had been uprooted from their homes in 1942 after Canada declared war on Japan. Just over half were sent to internment camps in the interior of British Columbia. Others were on forced labor projects in the Canadian prairies, and still others dispersed to hundreds of sites across Canada. All of them banned from the 100-mile stretch of the Pacific coast that was declared a protected area at the time of war. In 1945, as the end of that war came increasingly into view, officials visited Japanese Canadians wherever they were, from British Columbia to the province of Quebec. They banged on every door behind which they thought they might find a Japanese Canadian, seeking to convince as many of them as possible to depart for Japan. The official most responsible for administering this program, the repatriation program as it was called by Canadian officials, was a man named Tom Piggerskill, director of Japanese placement, hired for that role by the Department of Labor. In a visit to the camps in 1945, so Piggerskill toured the camps in advance of this effort to get them to sign forms accepting exile to Japan. In these visits, he met thousands of Japanese Canadians, and he summarized exchanges that he had with those Japanese Canadians for his bosses in Ottawa. When he visited, he presented Japanese Canadians with two alternatives. They could accept exile to Japan, sign a form to that effect, and then remain where they were living in sites of internment until the end of the war. This was the spring of 1945. Remain there till the end of the war, whenever that came. And at that time, the Canadian government would arrange and pay for their exile to Japan, their transport to Japan. Or if they refused to sign those forms, they were told that they'd be immediately required to relocate to points east, often thousands of miles east, to placements that the Canadian government would arrange for them. Pickersgill summarized the responses, the exchanges he had with Japanese Canadians, and he did it in a kind of question and answer format, drawing together the exchanges he had with many different Japanese Canadians and many different questions and answers given. So he wrote, Japanese Canadians asked, will relokees to Eastern Canada, so the people who refused to accept exile, will relokees to Eastern Canada receive treatment as full-fledged Canadian citizens? His response, we've replied quite frankly to this question that there are some details on which there's still some uncertainty. Question, will the relokees be given full rights to private enterprise, occupational freedom, a right to own and rent property, real and otherwise? Answer, we told them that a complete and satisfactory answer could not yet be given to this question. Question, will elementary and high school educations of relokees be granted on an equal basis as other residents of the province? Answer, we pointed out that education was the responsibility of the provincial and not Dominion government, and we could not definitely say what would apply. And so it continued through a long list of questions. Japanese Canadians asked the questions of parents worried about their children, of workers concerned about their employment prospects, families uncertain about their houses, citizens wary about their rights. Their questions emerged from the sustained intrusion of the state into every aspect of their lives. They inquired broadly, but also drilled down to details. In the years prior, the government had interfered in their employment and enterprise, their freedom of movement, had confiscated their property, and had failed to take responsibility for damages against them or to protect that property seized. To the great frustration of Japanese Canadians, it had failed to provide an education, especially for high school students in sites of internment, which prompted community-based responses. Pickersgill answered their questions with a cruel demonstration of power. He deliberately obfuscated, discouraging Japanese Canadians from envisioning a future in which they could belong in Canada. Upon the completion of his tour, Pickersgill expressed optimism that it had achieved its objectives. While I'm still reserving judgment, he wrote, the impression given to me during this trip suggests that there will be a substantial percentage of Japanese signing the applications for exile. This talk aims to explain how Canada got to that point. Across the globe, millions of people were uprooted and displaced in the second half of the 1940s as partition lines were drawn, empires collapsed into nations, and mixed local populations were compelled to unmix. In Canada, a similar project was underway. Japanese Canadians targeted for internment and uprooting since 1942 were pushed out of Canada. Canada participated in this global phenomenon in its own particular fashion. In a country where racism both competed with and mingled with notions of equal citizenship, where administrators of state policy were both emboldened by the tremendous powers granted them in the course of the war and concerned about the prospect of legal accountability when it ended. In this context, Canada concocted a process of heavily coerced choices. Japanese Canadians were asked, surveyed about whether they would be willing to go to Japan. But the intended results of the survey, the intended answer to the question, will you go to Japan, was clear from the start. This was a repatriation program. The purpose was not to gauge the opinion of Japanese Canadians, but rather to effect an expulsion. The exile program had emerged from the realization that eventually internment had to end. In 1943, the Undersecretary of State, Norman Robertson, warned the Prime Minister that, quote, we're likely to be faced with a problem of close to 25,000 residents of Canada of Japanese racial origin less than a third of whom are Japanese nationals. The communities from which the Japanese were evacuated are confident that they're gone for good and will probably resist their return. Such matters were often spoken of by Robertson and others as the Japanese problem, to which they concocted various solutions. There was no Japanese problem in 1940s Canada or in the decades prior when the phrase was frequently used on the West Coast. Rather, the policy was a problem. In wartime Canada, behind the closed doors of government, politicians and officials wrestled with the problems that emerged from their own draconian, often hastily concocted policies, compounding harms that they had already caused with the solutions that they purported to find. This talk is about one crucial stage in this cascade of injustice, a cascade as one government policy spilled to the next, each generating solutions that officials could imagine as the best of bad options that confronted them, and that could be justified on the basis of the internal logics that officials used in purporting to manage the difficult problems of race, racism, and wartime security. At this particular stage in this longer cascade of injustice, officials struggled to decide what to do as victory came into view and the camps had to close. The remainder of this talk sketches two proposed solutions to this problem of ending internment, which crisscrossed government. These proposals crisscrossed government departments, all debating what to do next between 1943 and 1945. That eventually led to Pickersgill's visit to those camps and the presentation of these two alternatives to Japanese Canadians. In the end, over 10,000 Japanese Canadians, almost 50% of the pre-war population, most of them British subjects, would be scheduled for exile before a court challenge and widespread protest in 1945 and 1946. And that court challenge and the protest won't be part of the story that I'll tell here, although they are in the book that Eric and I are writing. Instead, I want to sketch how Canada got to that point, to Pickersgill's visits to the camps, to the registration of 10,000 Japanese Canadians, mostly British subjects, for exile. So we have these two proposals for how that were circulating in government for how to deal with the end of internment. The first, to test the loyalty of Japanese Canadians and to expel those deemed disloyal, was abandoned. So I want to tell the story of the abandonment of that policy. And I want to suggest that that abandonment should in some ways surprise or puzzle us. The second proposal, to convince Japanese Canadians to volunteer for exile, replaced loyalty tests. So-called voluntary applications for banishment became Canada's somewhat strange path to exile. So first, this failed approach, loyalty testing. In August of 1944, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King told the House of Commons in Canada that the 2 previous years of battle had, quote, carried the Allied war effort across the Great Divide from uncertainty of victory on one side to certainty of victory on the other. The time had come, he said, for the government to devise a permanent post-war solution to the Japanese problem. To that end, King explained, the first, and in a sense fundamental task, is to determine the loyal and disloyal. The former would be dispersed across the country. They were to become the relokees, while the latter would, quote, not have the privilege of remaining in Canada. The Prime Minister followed these remarks with reflections that hinted at the underlying complexities of this fundamental task. Some Japanese Canadians, King said, had already been investigated, found to be, quote, suspicious or dangerous persons, and incarcerated with prisoners of war in Ontario in 2 camps that resembled greatly sites of internment here in Australia. So civilians interned alongside prisoners of war under conditions that generally conformed to the conventions, the Geneva Conventions that governed POWs. So some, I think a maximum of approximately 1,000 people, the numbers were changing, but at their maximum, about 1,000 people lived as suspicious or dangerous persons incarcerated in Ontario, far from BC. And yet, even among these cases, the Prime Minister informed the House of Commons, not all could be assumed to be disloyal. He explained, "Some may merely have misunderstood their dispossession from their property in the protected zones, and as peaceful and honest Canadian citizens, may have striven to protect and retain what they consider to be rightfully theirs. Misunderstanding is not the same as traitorous intent, and stubborn defense of one's own property is not necessarily disloyalty. On the other hand, there may be persons who have committed no act to justify their," he would have said, internment, I say incarceration, but who are in fact disloyal. They've committed no act, but in fact are disloyal. Listeners might have found some grounds for concern in these remarks. The Prime Minister frankly admitted that Japanese Canadians incarcerated by authorities as suspicious and dangerous were often, in fact, peaceful and honest Canadian citizens. He explained that draconian government actions, including the dispossession of property, might have added also family breakup in the first months of the uprooting, had prompted deep dissatisfaction and sometimes resistance among loyal Japanese Canadians. Nonetheless, he remarked, "It is a fact that no person of the Japanese race born in Canada has been charged with any act of sabotage," and he might have added that no other Japanese Canadians had either. Despite these facts, King announced that the policy would revolve around tests of loyalty. As further details of the horrors of Nazi Germany began to reach the Canadian public, camps of people interned on racial grounds were increasingly associated with state atrocity. 2 years prior, scarcely anyone, aside from Japanese Canadians themselves, had objected when the government uprooted and interned, quote, "all persons of the Japanese race" in the language of the orders. Now, public discussion turned. In response to King's August 1944 speech, Saskatchewan Member of Parliament M.J. Coldwell, member of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF, agreed that disloyal Japanese Canadians should be expelled, but also warned that, quote, "it is copying the policies of Hitler to discriminate against any people because of their race, color, or creed." In British Columbia, provincial politician Grace McInnes argued, "We're not dealing with Japanese, we're dealing with Canadians of Japanese origin. Anyone born in Canada, anyone naturalized under the laws of Canada, shall be regarded as a full Canadian." "Let's not become as Nazis," wrote the editors of the Ottawa Journal, demanding Parliament recognize the rights of citizens of Japanese racial origin. Meanwhile, officials close to the Prime Minister expressed unease with the ongoing internment and disenfranchisement of Japanese Canadians. "It's generally recognized," said one senior staffer in the Prime Minister's office, "it's generally recognized that the existing regulations and orders in council constitute a very great injustice." Still, and at the same time, widespread hostility towards Japanese Canadians persisted. A large majority of Japanese Canadians, 80%, polled in 1944, said that all Japanese nationals should be deported from Canada at the conclusion of the war. In British Columbia, politicians continued to stoke animosity. Alan Webster Neal, an independent member of Parliament from Vancouver Island, described the Japanese Canadians as, quote, "a cancer." British Columbia, he says, wishes to be rid of the Japs, dead or alive. Federal Cabinet Minister Ian Mackenzie, who is the only representative of the province of British Columbia in the federal cabinet, wanted to make his position, quote, "crystal clear to the Canadian public. He would not remain 24 hours as a member of any government that allows the Japanese back again to these British Columbia shores." In the summer of 1944, the Parliament amended elections law to fully disenfranchise Japanese Canadians wherever they lived. Whereas previously only those living in British Columbia had been barred from voting, as of 1944, Japanese Canadians would be disenfranchised across the country. Taken together, the moment pushed for officials to plan the unwinding of Canada's racist internment camps while still conforming to racist norms. The exile policy developed from these paradoxical pressures. In this context, officials tried to implement the vision laid out in King's speech to test loyalty, expel the disloyal, and allow, in the words of one staffer, the residual population of Japanese racial origin to reside in Canada where they should not be subject to special or peculiar disabilities. As another put it, dealing drastically with Japanese Canadians suspected of disloyalty would enable policymakers to deal justly with those who were blameless. The challenge was how to scrutinize, segregate, and expel the disloyal, allowing for the, quote, residuum to reside in Canada on the basis of non-discrimination. So the exile policy emerges from this strange impulse to exile people on the basis of race in order to eliminate discriminatory policies and practices in Canada. This approach seemed to offer something to both ardent racists and proponents of a more liberal policy. White supremacists could anticipate the expulsion of many Japanese Canadians from the country, while liberals could satisfy themselves with the promise that they would, quote, give freedom to those who remain. To accomplish this aim, bureaucrats had to figure out who precisely would be deemed disloyal, who would be expelled. A young staff member in the Prime Minister's office who went on to a very illustrious career in the civil service by the name of Gordon Robertson took a lead in the planning process. He was the first to propose a detailed plan for distinguishing the loyal from the disloyal. He proposed that all persons of the Japanese race, whom the government had incarcerated in those POW camps in Ontario, would be presumed disloyal and expelled. So too would anyone who had openly expressed allegiance with Japan. Other Japanese nationals could avoid expulsion if they made a declaration that they would abide by Canadian law and refrain from interfering in the war effort. All British subjects of Japanese descent, born and naturalized, would also have to affirm their loyalty and deny fealty to Japan. Finally, and superseding all of those declarations and other processes, all Japanese Canadians would be subject to investigation at any time for reclassification as disloyal and therefore expulsion. This process, Robertson knew, would be cumbersome and complex. It would require investigations, the collecting of declarations, and so on. Its legality also raised serious questions. Robertson, reviewing the orders in council that existed at the time, concluded that they were insufficient to empower the government to strip British subject status from British subjects and to expel them from the country. And so new orders in council would be required. But if all went according to plan, Robertson felt that this proposal could achieve the dual policy aims of reducing the Japanese Canadian population and regularizing the citizenship of the rest. It's impossible, he said, it's impossible to know in advance how large the residue would be. But he felt sure that if the, quote, hardcore disloyal and alien elements were removed, the remainder would be allowed to continue to live in Canada without restriction. These proposals generated almost a year of discussion in Canada, a period that overlapped King's speech in Parliament, 1943 to mid-1945. And these discussions were about the supposed inscrutability of Japanese Canadian loyalty. Officials were divided and opinionated. The Deputy Minister of Labour, Arthur McNamara, worried that economic considerations would motivate Japanese Canadians to falsely declare loyalty to Canada. So this wouldn't be a pure feeling of loyalty, but rather affected by practical considerations. Norman Robertson, in External Affairs, doubted the utility of declarations altogether. He preferred a measure of conduct. Those whose actions demonstrated loyalty to Canada could remain, while the rest would be expelled. Officials debated the relationship between citizenship and loyalty. Did the decision of immigrants from Japan to naturalize as British subjects in Canada, which they were permitted by law to do throughout the period before the 1940s, did that decision reflect loyalty to the British Crown? Were those Japanese nationals, that third of the population who had not naturalized as Canadian, did that mean that they were inherently disloyal? And what of the Canadian-born? In answer to such questions, officials found little common ground. The Assistant Deputy Minister of Labour argued that an inquiry into the loyalty of a Japanese national is a waste of time. It must be assumed that his loyalties lie with Japan. His boss, Arthur McNamara, concurred. A presumption of deportation should apply, he said, to all Japanese nationals. Others, though, disagreed. In the Office of the Custodian of Enemy Property, which had seized the homes and businesses and belongings of Japanese Canadians, Ephraim Coleman, who oversaw that process, had seen objections from Canadian-born Japanese Canadians as well. Many Canadian-born Japanese, he said, were more undesirable than the Japanese nationals. The Undersecretary of State concluded that it was impossible to determine loyalty on the basis of nationality. Instead, I think in each case, it will simply have to be a question of examination into the personal conduct, attitude in the war, cooperation with Canadian authorities, length of residence here, and so forth. So a fairly complex calculation. From diplomats in Washington came advice culled from the American experience, where they had applied a loyalty test in the year prior. Dylan Meyer, director of the War Relocation Authority, responsible for American incarceration sites, disapproved of any compulsory expulsions. They should be deported only if they want to go back to Japan. And he suggested the recognition of only one category of dangerous persons, those guilty of acts of disloyalty. The question of loyalty was thus a thicket that proved thornier the deeper Canadian officials pushed into it. And I want to suggest that we should find that surprising. Recall that 80% of Canadians surveyed in 1944 had supported expelling all Japanese nationals. And that was effectively what was done here in Australia. Expelling Japanese nationals wouldn't encounter the legal obstacles that expelling British subjects would. And it would accomplish significantly accomplish the aims of the government by reducing the population by at least a third and probably more, as Canadian-born children and naturalized spouses and so on of Japanese nationals surely would have gone as well. On the other hand, in 1943, the United States had applied this loyalty test. So if Canadian officials wanted to imitate American policy, as some scholars have suggested Canadian policy did, they had a template in the United States for testing loyalty and demanding declarations from Japanese Canadians. So they could easily have applied, it would seem, that loyalty test in Canada as well. But they didn't take either path, either of which would have accomplished the aims laid out by the Prime Minister and fulfilled the promises of the Prime Minister in his 1944 speech in the House of Commons. So we should ask, why didn't they? Why did that proposal fail? It seems that there were other ways of thinking about loyalty and citizenship in Canada at the time that extended beyond formal citizenship. There was a discomfort in Canada with simply expelling people who were Japanese nationals. There was a sense that some of them might very much be Canadian. And at the same time, there were ways of thinking about Japanese Canadians that extended beyond merely racism. And the complexity of these ideas obstructed what might otherwise have been a straightforward path to accomplishing the aims that the government had laid out. So instead, an alternative approach was devised. These coerced, voluntary exiles. That emerged as the direction of policy in the fall of 1944, some months after King's speech to Parliament. Without any clear way to define loyalty, officials moved in this other direction. This alternative, complementary path to reducing the Japanese Canadian population had actually lingered in policy discussions from the start. And ultimately, it ended up displacing entirely loyalty tests. There was never any loyalty tests in Canada. And this alternative was to get Japanese Canadians to volunteer themselves for exile. From the start, officials had envisioned that some Japanese Canadians might actually want to leave the country by choice. Indeed, some had already gone. When the government initiated the uprooting from coastal British Columbia in the spring of 1942, a small number of people of Japanese descent, diplomatic officials, and select Japanese nationals and some British subjects who were their relatives had shipped to Japan as part of the reciprocal exchanges that are arranged between countries even at times of war. And this continued in the year that followed, so that by the time of the discussion that we're talking about, some 220 Japanese Canadians had left the country. When King addressed Parliament in 1944, he mentioned briefly that there may also be some persons who will voluntarily indicate a desire to proceed to Japan. For the moment, though, this possibility was buried beneath planning for more coercive mechanisms, investigations, interrogations, examinations of conduct, and so on, of mechanisms for exiling people presumed unwilling to go. Gordon Robertson, that young official who I just mentioned earlier, made a simple but transformative suggestion in the fall of 1944: change the order of operations in the exile process. Voluntary exile, he suggested, might precede loyalty tests, which might come after. It would greatly assist the work of the commission, a loyalty commission, Robertson said, and also help toward achieving a reduction in the post-war population in Canada if Japanese persons could be encouraged to give voluntary indication of a desire to go to Japan after the war. This suggestion dramatically altered Canada's path forward. By contrast to the question of loyalty, the notion of voluntary expulsion generated rapid and easy consensus. According to the Deputy Ministry of Labor, by mid-October, just shortly after Robertson first floated this idea, it's been generally agreed that our policy should be to obtain applications for the return to Japan of as many persons of the Japanese race as are inclined to do so. Before the end of that month, drafts of this policy were circulating to multiple departments and then to cabinet. So-called voluntary expulsion would serve as the foundation for Canada's exile of Japanese Canadians. Plans for the Loyalty Commission persisted, and in fact, an order in council was passed to authorize it, but it was never formed and never did any work. Instead, the voluntary process was a runaway success from the perspective of officials. They got far more signatures than they initially anticipated, and they abandoned the need for any other mechanisms at all. If Japanese Canadians volunteered to go, officials seemed to think that no one could object. Many did, in fact, object to the sham of free choice in the context of a forced uprooting. It would be the fate of people alleged to have volunteered for banishment that would be adjudicated in Canada's highest courts and at the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council and publicly debated. Nevertheless, in the fall of 1944, within government circles, voluntary expulsion moved toward approval without stirring any controversy or pushback, including from people who had been liberals and objected to a number of other facets of the policy, such as the dispossession of property. Soon, drafts of the forms that Japanese Canadians might sign were circulating. RCMP officials were selected to take them to the camps, and Pickersgill was appointed to lead the program and to inform Japanese Canadians of their options. On February 2nd, 1945, Cabinet approved the scheme to first obtain voluntary applications for repatriation to Japan, and then to facilitate later a loyalty commission. And very shortly thereafter, Pickersgill departed for the camps and those interviews that he described. His job was to turn uprooted people into exiles. A few concluding remarks, and then I'll look forward to discussion. Sociologist Rogers Brubaker has devoted sustained attention to various cases of unmixings of populations, a kind of an opposite to the international migrations that create cosmopolitan cities, diverse neighborhoods, and multicultural nations. Migrations tied to unmixing projects instead are conducive of homogeneity. Brubaker has sifted various cases in Europe, ranging across the 20th century, exploring in part what he sees as a line between coercive and voluntary forms of unmixing. He suggests, for example, that a line might be drawn when it comes to the role that fear plays in motivating these migrations. Fear, Brubaker writes, is a capricious concept. There's a world of difference between migration arising from a sharply focused fear of imminent violence and migration, on the other hand, migration engendered by a diffuse fear, concern, or anxiety about one's well-being or the well-being of one's children in the future. A similar spectrum, although I'm not so sure about the sharp divide that Brubaker envisions, but a similar spectrum might be thought to exist within policymaking. We might imagine ranging from the management of voluntary migration flows to violent state actions of ethnic cleansing. For me, the point is not so much to decide the breaks on that continuum, or even to offer terminology for its various gradients. I leave those to other scholars and perhaps other fields. Instead, while keeping in mind this question of voluntary and coerced migrations and how they might fit together, I take inspiration from Alf Lüdtke, an historian and lifelong student of political violence. Lüdtke urged historians, quote, not to fall prey to the attraction of seemingly clear-cut distinctions or bold definitions, and to deploy instead a more sensitive approach to concrete actions and scenes. Find the people who populate histories of violence, he advised, and seek to understand their actions, in each case asking how questions. How did he or she do it? This question moves in multiple directions within this study and in the book that Eric and I are writing, engaging both people making judgments, rather making and judging such policies, and the people who experience their harms. In this book, it leads us to convey the experiences of the exiles and the exiles themselves, the Japanese Canadians confronting this question and confronting Pickersgill, and to try to understand the complex interplay of coercion and choice in their displacement. And it also leads us to those historical scenes in which the policy was planned and implemented. At this particular moment in Canadian history, officials chose racism that was purportedly shaped by this effort to eliminate discriminatory statutes in Canada. They chose a banishment that they could construe as a choice. They chose an ethnic cleansing that at least some of them hoped would lead to equal citizenship. In the years that followed, this path that they chose would be opposed by Japanese Canadians, challenged in the country's highest courts, and eventually castigated by the Canadian public. For the moment, though, officials could feel that they had found another ingenious solution to the problems that they confronted. No one in the room in 1944, at least, seemed to see that the problem was, as it had been since 1942, the uprooting of people on the basis of race. Thank you. Sure, yeah, let's see how, yeah. So
Sorry, thank you. Fantastic presentation. So interesting. I'm just thinking with regards to what comes before all this, because I don't know. I'm sort of not a historian of Canada or immigration in Canada, but I mean, what's so striking about what you're telling me from the Australian perspective is that, you know, that kind of notion of unmixing in Australia seems rather foreign because, you know, there was no kind of perceived mix to unmix in some ways because of the White Australia policy. You know, that kind of figures so much in the way of thinking about migration, race in Australia, and leads to, as you mentioned, kind of the deportation of Japanese prisoners of war who've come over and end up in internment camps in Australia, but also, you know, Australian citizens who are Japanese. I mean, we have stories in places like Carroll. We've got men who have Japanese descent, but who have fought in the First World War, who have sons who have fought in the Second World War, but end up in internment camps and then end up being exiled back to Japan. And so while, like, I think you're rightly pointing to the racism and the kind of the hidden choice, the fact that there even is a discussion of a choice seems really interesting from the Australian context, because we have the White Australia policy, which is all about, you know, the unmixing of race, keeping race out. So I'm just wondering what's the immigration policy before that? How are immigrants figured in the kind of popular imagination, and also the sort of practicalities of migration, and where is the place of migrants seen before the Second World War, and perhaps how that helps to kind of, I guess, lead to the kind of, I mean, it's not nuanced, but it's far more nuanced than the Australian perspective. I'm sorry, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. Rainer and I were just discussing, I was trying to entice Rainer and others to be doing more work and comparative work in this area. So there's the, on the one hand, the choice. On the other hand, in Canada, they're contemplating and undertaking a mass exile of British subjects. And so there's a way in which they transgress lines in Canada that they're not doing here, right? So there's a way in which, a very simple, and I still am probably, I've now been here for 5 months or so, so and I've been in this environment and trying to think about Australia a little bit, although I've mostly been doing this Canadian work. So I should by now have arrived at something more sophisticated, but I still have this sort of simple view that Australia in some way reflects the policies that British Columbia would have implemented if it was freed from the shackles of Canadian federalism. And so you have British Columbia wanting to implement laws that would have banned across the entire labor market, for example, Asian immigrants, and sometimes Indigenous people are also folded into those same pieces of legislation. But those are disallowed at the federal level. So British Columbia is not able to implement the kind of total ban on Asian immigration that Australia essentially has, and similarly, naturalization law falls outside the scope of what British Columbia can touch. So you have a kind of a tension there, a jurisdictional tension. It's not that the federal government is necessarily friendly toward Asian immigrants either, but you're kind of working out a kind of jurisdictional differences in how restriction can be implemented. So we have in Canada large immigration, as in the U.S., especially right at the turn of the 20th century, that then through diplomatic, basically immigration controls imposed through diplomatic agreements with Japan. So Japan imposes, exit restrictions, prevents that large number of immigrants from continuing to come to Canada. But there are exceptions, including for wives, students, merchants. So still some 13,000 Japanese immigrants come and settle in Canada between the 1907 basically restriction and the Second World War. So in Canada, you have lots of, daily, we did a kind of survey of newspapers, there's daily derogatory portrayals of Japanese immigrants in British Columbia newspapers, and the most popular British Columbia newspapers are politicians who are making their career around the notion of exclusion. Japanese Canadians are disenfranchised federally and provincially, but they continue to be able to come in restricted numbers, and they continue to be able to naturalize and purchase property and so on. So you have, in a way, had Australia been constrained in that way, maybe these counterfactuals aren't that interesting. I think counterfactually, I don't know, we're not supposed to, but I do. But you kind of can imagine that in Australia, if, that you would have had perhaps under a similar policy framework, you would have had a smaller but a multi-generational community as well, where wives had joined those initial migrants. They had children, so you had lots of Japanese Australian children still facing a kind of second-class citizenship and so on, but a population that's growing, that's multi-generational, that's well-settled, is in a range of different occupations and many different communities, settled communities and enduring communities. So that's the setting into which we enter in 1942. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I have two interconnected questions. The first is kind of similar to James's. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about the intellectual and cultural climate before World War II around how the Canadian government inherited the concept of race that it did. I can only speak to work that I've done. I've researched a lot about Italian fascism in Northeast Africa and the proliferation of concentrationary spaces and camps there. And they're, like with any huge concept like race, they have an intellectual history to them. And I was wondering if you could comment on what makes the Canadian government's intellectual inheritance of an idea of race unique. And the second is on the methodology of your book. So I'm a history and law student, and I think that this is an interesting, this book represents an interesting potential for methodological play and creativity, you talk about concepts like loyalty and fear, which speak to me as having a strong history of emotions background, for example. So I was wondering if you could comment on what conceptual framework the book will take on some of these questions.
Those are great questions. Challenging ones. Thank you. So on the first question, I'm not sure that Canada has, I'm not sure I would describe Canada as having a unique history of race. I think, you know, the dynamics, for instance, described in May Nai's book around Chinese international migration and the kind of spread of a kind of global Chinese question. I think Canada is actually not really included in that book, the Chinese question, but I think could have been. It sort of it reads like a book that could have just it includes Australia, but not Canada, and it feels like Canada could have been another case in that study about kind of the global proliferation of ideas about the particular kinds of perils that Asian migration represented, and then other work also on the emergence of, you know, border control regimes to deal with that. Canada, as in Australia, the context of settler colonialism and the notion of British Columbia in particular as a kind of outpost of British Empire that's only very recently become a majority white place in the early 20th century. And so there's very concrete statements and thinking in British Columbia that adopt this notion of space that over which different racial groups are competing for dominance, and one within which the you know, white dominance is both kind of new and potentially imperiled, in particular by the prospect of large Asian migration to Canada. So I think those are probably backgrounds that the story shares with other settings. Methodologically, I mean, I guess I think it may be a dodge of your question. I'm not sure, but I think, you know, the principal challenge, I think, for Eric and I in writing this book has been that the book is envisioned as it's part of a series that envisions also readership among legal professionals and judges. There's a couple of series like this in Canada that envisioned themselves as kind of crossover audience books. So, you know, the reflections on Rogers Brubaker, for example, here don't appear in the book. It's a more narrative structure. So the challenge, that has been the principal kind of, I think, genre or methodological challenge for us, is how to do that work of attempting to provide some kind of analysis of topics that would interest someone like you, while also writing a book as a kind of a story. And that's been really rewarding and really interesting, but challenging. Yeah.
Thank you. Luke Nottage, Professor of Comparative Law with a particular interest in Japan. Sorry, I came from teaching a Japanese law class and I've got to go back in 2 minutes. But and I was at UVic before I immigrated to Australia for 6 months at Cappy with new building.
Oh yes.
Anyway,
yeah, we're based at Cappy.
So thanks for your talk. I'm sorry I arrived late. So in a nutshell, so what happened is they interned the Japanese and then decided that was worse than the alternative, which was initially to say to impose this sort of loyalty test or declaration, or try and, you know, find some characteristics that would distinguish the two groups, and send some of them back to Japan. But then that got too hard, so they ended up with this sort of voluntary scheme. You know, morally, sort of the end point, the voluntary choice, if it is a choice, seems better than the other alternatives. But my question is, like, so how many people said, okay, I'll go back to Japan after the war, where, you know, Japan had been severely bombed and terrible economic situation, pretty obviously to anyone thinking of going home. I mean, how many people, or what proportion actually went back?
Yeah, so good question. Yeah, so 10,000, just over 10,000 people, so about half of the pre-war coastal population. There are about 25,000, there are children being born and so on. So there are about 25,000 Japanese Canadians by 46 and 10,634, I think, sign for exile. And then after Japan's surrender, many of them seek to rescind. And so the legal case revolves around that effort to rescind largely. And in the end, no, I must have been wrong with 64 because I think it's 3,964 people who are exiled to Japan. And those people go ostensibly after this voluntary scheme kind of collapses in the face of public protest, but not legal challenge. It survives legal challenges and the JCPC finds it to be fully legal. Right after that legal victory, the extent of objection in Canada just makes it politically unsupportable. So in the end, the 3,964 people go supposedly on what the government now starts to call a purely voluntary, suggesting that perhaps the previous voluntary program wasn't purely voluntary, but they go on a supposedly purely voluntary basis so that in theory, they can change their mind on the deck to the ship and leave. But in practice, first of all, many are children or under 16 are dependents, and many are going very reluctantly, and they've in any event signed in the context of this very coercive process. But so yeah, so you have to go to multiple stages here. I'll just say in regards to the ethics of it, or kind of which process was preferable. In the United States in 1943, they apply a loyalty test. So it's these kinds of declarations and interrogations that is designed to produce positive responses. It's designed to generate evidence of Japanese American loyalty to the United States so that the Americans can start to move people out of their camps. And so there are people who are deemed disloyal and they are segregated, but the kind of design of the loyalty questionnaire is to produce loyalty. The Canadian voluntary process is designed to produce exiles, right? So it's sort of and then meanwhile here in Australia, as we've been saying, there's no choice at all, and yet the category is in some way more constrained than that in Canada. So it's very interesting to me to try to think through what are, one conclusion. There's a one conclusion that I'm tempted by, having read some work by a PhD student here in Australia on the loss of property of Japanese Australians. This is another area where policies go in different directions in different places, where in Canada they seize and sell all of the property of Japanese Canadians, and in Australia officials all departments are disavowing any responsibility for the property of Japanese Australians. So you have kind of two divergent options, administrative options, both of which lead to massive property losses. So similarly with these, loyalty tests of various kinds, the one simple conclusion, I guess, is once you begin to uproot and displace people en masse on the basis of race, you don't have good policy alternatives left, right? Whether you seize the property or don't seize the property, whether you apply a test of declarations or ask for voluntary, you're on a policy pathway that is wrong, and you don't, none of these alternatives in some sense is better than the other.
Thank you. Before you go, Professor, I know I'll catch up with you after, but our project is housed at the Center of Asia Pacific Initiatives. So you must know Helen and such. And Victor, oh yes, okay. So we'll catch up afterwards. Thank you for that. Yes, okay. Thank you. But my question was going to be very similar to that. So maybe it's a little bit of a follow-up. My father's family was one of the 10,000 that signed up, but obviously didn't go, or I'd be saying this in Japanese. That 3,900 or the other 6,000, can you just elaborate a little bit? I know it's outside of your talk, but the public protests. What can you just elaborate a little bit on why it wasn't 10,000 and it was only 4,000?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So this is Mike Abe, who's a project manager for Landscapes of Injustice and Past Wrongs, Future Choices, these two big projects that we've been involved in. And it's great to see Mike here from Canada, getting to see him for the first time in a number of months. Yeah, I mean, I think you have, as you already heard in response to King's speech in 44, you have, and even within the bureaucracy, you have people who have serious misgivings in the 1944, 45, 46 around both the dispossession of property, which becomes a big political issue as well, and the deportation and citizenship stripping. And so you have those voices which now join with Japanese Canadian objections that had been voiced from the very first moments of the uprooting through the property dispossession and up through the exile process. So by 45, the war's over. The kinds of atrocities and racialized atrocities are increasingly obvious to everyone, and people have a sense of, well, what is Canada if we can strip the property and the citizenship and deport to Japan Canadian citizens? What is Canadian citizenship worth? And you have at the same time kind of new discussions about Canadian citizenship and a new Canadian citizenship law that's going to come in the same period. And so the Japanese Canadian voices of protest that have been there all along suddenly find increasing number of allies outside of the community. It's no longer obviously seditious or anything to question what the government's doing in 1945, the way it had been perhaps felt to be in 1942, say. And so so the Liberals decide we're going to lose seats. You know, like this is not worth it politically. Our potential gains are outweighed by our losses here. And there's some sense Eric thinks, and I don't know how well substantiated this is, Eric thinks they wouldn't have minded, in fact, if the courts, if the JCPC had found that that they couldn't exile Canadian, that mightn't have been a bad outcome from the perspective of many in the Liberal administration. Yeah, oh, the courts, we've been prevented from doing this by the courts. So then they come out, they have that victory in the courts, but they are confronting a political problem. And so that's kind of the very end of our book, and kind of leads into the post-war rights that are a concern of Eric's. Yeah.